Hey, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Howie Jacobson. Quick reminder that the new book is out. You can change other people, the 4 steps to help your colleagues, employees, even family up their game. This is a business book, but it's also a personal book. I wrote it from my experience as a coach, helping people change entrenched self-sabotaging behaviors. And I put all my knowledge and all of Peter Bregman, my co-author's knowledge, into a book to help you do the same thing with the people that you care about in your life. So it's available right now. It is for sale wherever books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookstore.org, your local independent bookshop, my personal preference, if you can do that. And I would love for you to get a copy. That is one amazing way to support me, is to help the sales of the book, and to read it and implement it. And if you like, go on Amazon or somewhere and leave a review. All right, so let's get to today's episode. All right, let's get to today's show. So I really hope today's conversation blows your mind. My guest is Tyson Yunkaporta, who wrote a book called Sand Talk, which is probably the most significant book I have ever read in terms of how quickly and comprehensively and how deeply it changed my view of reality. It reminds me of Ishmael, a book that I first read maybe 15, 20 years ago. And it talks about a lot of the same sorts of things, about where human civilization has gone off the rails and how we can use genuine, existing indigenous ways of thinking and knowing and being and relating to begin to fix it. So I heard about the book from Glenn Murphy, who's been on this podcast many times, and Glenn really had to push me to read it. I was kind of busy and it didn't seem that crucial to what I was working on at the time, but I'm glad he did, and I wanted to have Glenn on the podcast as well. And as it turns out, Glenn and Tyson had a lot to talk about in the connection between Tyson's view of the world and Glenn's practice of Sistema, the martial art that Glenn is my teacher of. Sorry to end that sentence with a preposition there. And so again, I stepped back a little bit and let them yarn, as Tyson might put it, talking about the world and energy flows and violence. And it was really interesting because I wanted to come at this from a vegan perspective. And I would love to invite Tyson back on the podcast to talk about these issues specifically, about health and eating animals and eating plants. But for me, veganism feels like it's the best thing we can do in this culture, in this context of this civilization. However, that doesn't mean it's the best thing we could do in any given context or civilization. And there's a way in which I'm uncomfortable that veganism can kind of dismiss an Aboriginal, an indigenous perspective, which includes living in an ecosystem that involves flows of energy from plants and animals, and not just exclusively focusing on plants. So I've got a lot to think about here, and I'd like to revisit it. But essentially, this conversation is about civilization itself, this idea of growing cities, of concentrations of wealth and power, of the way in which we think about how technology is going to serve us. The whole thing's a dead end. And from within civilization, from within this 10,000-year experiment, it's impossible to see. But when you step outside it, and when you contact the Aboriginal knowledge that Tyson shares in the book Sand Talk and in our conversation, you can see that there are radically different ways of being that are possible. So that's what I hope you get from this conversation. I would love to hear your thoughts. So without further ado, I just want to start by saying, like, I don't understand what the book did to me or how it did it. I only know that it was like Flatland, where I had what I thought was a very sophisticated understanding of culture and the parameters of civilization and what I was trying to achieve and what was possible. And 20 minutes into listening to the audiobook, which you narrate, I was like, oh my God, like, you've shown me my culture from a completely different perspective, where I can see its flaws, its limitations, and its potential. And I felt like I was being reminded as opposed to being told. So I just, like, I don't know what you did or how you did it, or whether you wrote a normal book first before turning it into this, but there's powerful magic in it for me.
There is powerful magic. Yeah, that's all coming from that old fella. Yeah, I have to pay my respects to him, old man Juma, and like a number of others, but primarily, him. It's his magic in that book that messes with our DNA, all of us. It does. It changes you. There's a big ritual magic in those Sandtalk drawings that he does.
Yeah, there's something about the imagery and the use of imagery in order to not just assist understanding, but kind of reify it in some way. It's like it's often sometimes when you have an image or a metaphor, it can anchor you too soon sometimes to a concept, right? And you get lost in that picture, and you're like, oh, I think I know what that means, and then everything that you listen to after that just becomes some reinforcement of what you think you already know. But I didn't get that. I didn't get that with this at all. It's like you put up the picture, and then I started to listen to it, and I'm like, I'm not sure I get it. I'm not sure where this is going, and then it would kind of percolate, and then by the end of it, the picture made sense, and then the picture also helped me remember all the complex ideas and things that would come together in the midst.
That's how the magic works. It's not a roofie.
Yeah,
it's not a powerful wizard going zap and turning you into a rabbit. Yeah, you're an agent there. You get to evolve as you wish.
Yeah,
or not evolve. You can devolve if you like.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
Yeah,
and I don't know, that there's always that agency. Like in proper magic, there's always agency. It's not something that you can do on your own. So that idea of somebody doing something on their own to something else, I have the power. Rah! That's in any context, magical or otherwise, it's no good. Right. But here's the thing, and when magic is real, one of the indicators for me that it's real, I mean, apart from you check the force and that, one of the indicators that magic is real is that when it happens, the people who are doing it, they don't really care about it. Like it's no big deal.
Yeah.
And like there is a particular attitude when people practice what a lot of people think of as miraculous stuff. There's a particular attitude where it's just no big deal, and they're not really calling on anyone to witness and they're not trying to say that it's anything that nobody else can do. You know what I mean? And they're happy to share what it is. And no, it's not a miracle. It's just here, I put this here and I do that. Yeah. That's what attracted me to Systema when I first saw it, is that I was seeing, like, you can't tell what's going on a video, what's real and what's not. But what I did see was an attitude towards what they were doing that was just, no, it's right. There's nothing special here. It's just, this is what you do.
Yeah, there's a sense that sometimes when I experience it, sorry,
there was just no narcissism in it. Sorry, it was a long way of talking to get around to that, but I think it's a really important foundation to ground the conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, actually, there's, in my experience of things that I had trouble defining or working with in Systema. My background, my training was in hard sciences, right? So I did genetics and immunology, and I was very proud of my knowledge and the things that I'd learned up to I was about 25. And I would, dismiss people, religious believers and other ways of knowing things as just like primitive. We've evolved beyond that. This is, patterns are everything. All there is logic, reason, and objective induction of things, and I'm not even involved in that process, and neither are any other scientists. It doesn't matter who's doing the reasoning or who's doing the deducing. It's all just knowledge, right? And this is kind of a little story that scientists as we tell ourselves to make the knowledge more powerful or more significant. And there's no doubt about it. Science is a very powerful way of figuring things out. And in your book, you liken it to pattern mind, right? As just like one way of looking at things, like spotting patterns. And science is just one way of spotting patterns and acting on those patterns, like from among many other types of pattern. And the tendency in science is to boil things down to just the things that you can see immediately and to disconnect them from the wider system, and all of those things as well, which you allude to in the book a lot as well. But what's interesting for me was when I first started to experience things outside of what could easily be explained by straight scientific reason and what we know about biology and physics and physiology. I think probably my first experience of that was moving to Japan and being at a party, like coming back from Tokyo after a long night. And I was lying on a couch with a friend's house that I didn't know all that well. And then this strange middle-aged lady just plonked herself down into the couch next to me. And just kind of reached across. In Japanese, she was like, "Are you okay?" Like, "Daijoubu?" And I was just like, "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm fine." And she just kind of put her hand over the top of my belly, and it was a good 4 or 5 inches away from my belly. And then suddenly it started feeling extraordinarily warm. She didn't touch it. She didn't do anything. It was no trick. And she's just like, "You have a lot of problems with your stomach. You should look into that." And then she just sat back into the chair. She didn't try and sell me anything. She didn't try and get me to sign up for her cult or anything like that. And I was just like, I've been having stomach problems for about 6 months. And she just somehow sensed it. And then somehow she didn't cure me or anything like that. She was just like, "You definitely got something going on." Yeah,
she's not
exactly.
A guru. She doesn't have a studio.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's just an old lady. She's someone's granny and she works out the back of the flower shop. That's it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Special. And that's when you know it's real.
Yeah, and the same thing with Systema as well. When I first been, I saw the stuff on the videos too, and I'm like, this is probably fake. Let me try it out, and then I can prove that I know stuff and they don't, and they're just being silly. They're complicit in some way. And then I met Vladimir and worked with people with enormous skill and enormous ability to kind of steer attention and move you and make you feel things without you understanding it. And I've experienced it and been on the receiving end. And even after having spent time with those people for limited periods of time, been able to do those things. So, do you know what I mean? Some part of it kind of infects you. And even when you're not trying to, suddenly you have this for a while, and then you're trying to kind of cling to what the principles were there. How did I do that? And it's kind of fleeting. But the same thing is true. It's like it's not a big deal to them. They're not like, "Oh, watch me do some magic." They're like, yeah. And then they flippantly stop doing it and you move on. They're like, "Forget about that. We'll move on to something else. That's not important." It's very much the same
what struck
feeling.
me is it was kind of on the cusp between a couple of different disciplines, in sort of that energetic kind of way. It's halfway between like kinetic and illusion.
Sure.
In terms of it's neither of those things, and it's not both either. It's something else.
It is. Yeah.
I'm often thinking about the way we act on the world with our intent and everything else. And there's basically two sort of schools of action in the world right now, and the main one is that acts on perception, and the other one, which is a bit more old school, is the one that acts on condition. So that's all our activism and politics and all that sort of stuff.
Can you explain that a bit more? What do you mean by condition? What do you mean?
Well, we used to in politics and activism and all that sort of thing, what we used to do decades ago was act to try and change the condition. And we would act directly on the condition, the social condition that we wanted to change. Now it's about perception. It's about, fighting to be perceived in this way, or to be, you know what I mean?
To signal that you care about this or something. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't change the material reality, but you can change its branding. And we can all fight over the branding on the optics and what it looks like and what it's called and all that sort of stuff. And who can marry who in the middle of the whole goddamn thing. That's what we're allowed to fight over. But in terms of actual condition, we're not allowed to do that. So I'm often thinking about that, especially if you read in the book about that idea of the turnaround, that sort of interaction between the tangible and intangible worlds.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I just saw it. I just saw quite strongly in your discipline. It's like there were elements of suggestion there.
Yeah.
But only the kinetic elements that I hadn't been aware of previously. You know what I mean? Like it's a completely different thing. Like it needs another word. Yeah. It needs another physics to describe what it is that you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think people often come to it and then try and, myself included, come to it and then try and kind of put it into an existing packet or a box or some cognitive hook they already have. They're like, oh, that's sleight of hand, and that's kind of like use of complex physics, and that's like suggestibility or like manipulating balance or things like that, and they try and explain it all the way with that. But none of the people who explain it that way can actually do it, which is interesting to me. In the same way that you might have somebody trying to explain away some old man Juma doing something and be like, I'm pretty sure he had an EMP and he disabled the airport that way. You know what I mean? They come up with some sort of thing, but they can't do it themselves, and they can't do it without an EMP. And so there's this tendency to want to try and explain something away. And something that I've learned is just like, why? And I think that's one of the things that really arrested me about this book. I think I've had this little nagging thing in the back of my head the whole time, in which I've been trying to explore different disciplines of thought. And typically the path that most people in modern Western civilizations go is that, okay, we've gone as far as I can with straight up what I'm being force-fed in the modern world. So I'm going to go old school. I'm going to look at like the Stoics and the ancient Greeks and things like that. And then if you're getting really exotic, then maybe you might, read the Vedas and try and study some Indian knowledge or some ancient Buddhism or even some like ancient Mayan stuff or something like that, right? And that's kind of about as far back as people go. And that's the exoticism and that's the breadth of knowledge. And there's a lot that people gain from that. And a lot of people have learned a lot about themselves and the world and how to be decent people by studying older modes of thought than the Greeks, right? But reading this book, like as Howie kind of alluded to there at the beginning, I was reading it, I was like, oh wow, this goes way further back. Like this is like all of those things are comparatively new on the time scale of how to know and understand and think about things. And it just seemed to me to open up this entire world of pre-existing thought and ways of being that had never even been alluded to, even in kind of somewhat exotic and apparently ancient, a few thousand years old things like Zen and Buddhism and stuff like that, as you go through it as well.
Yeah.
So really interesting to me. I was like, wow, what a font is there. And your central thesis in the book, well, not the central, there's lots of things in there, but it's, but one of the things you talk about is that, for me anyway, this idea that in the past, when people have looked at Indigenous thought, it's been like, well, let's take my modern Mr. Carruthers anthropologist mask and get my monocle out, and we'll look at this quaint little Indigenous thought pattern, and we'll see if we can mine it for things that are useful, and then we'll use that to improve the optics of our sustainability effort or whatever it's going to be, right? We'll look at us learning from the Native Americans, and look at us, do you know what I mean? Like learning from the people, but it's not really immersing yourself in that pattern of thought at all. It's still using that same kind of inductive reasoning, straight pattern spotting thing. And what you did was the opposite. Right? You flipped it. You took Indigenous thought and looked at Western thought like it was an alien, like it was a bunch of weird populations doing weird things. And in doing that, we're like, yeah, that is weird. It really was like, and that's the first time in my life I've really looked at it that way. Moving to Japan and living there made me think about how weird British people are. When I started to think about, I learned more about Britain than I did about Japan while I was living there. And the same thing, moving to America made me think about Britain and Japan in a different way, but this made me think about being a human being in a different way. I was like, what assumptions have I been making all this time?
Oh well, it's not what you've been making. It's what's been kind of programmed. Yeah, I mean, you're living in a context, and you can't be responsible for all the ways all the evolutionary dynamics of your context and the pressures that they have on you and the mutations that happen as a result of that. It is exciting to talk to different people and just see that entire thing flipped upside down for a minute, as you said, and it's given a bit of a shake. Yeah. And you see what falls out. And when you look in there again, you see what's good. I hate this critique that's just designed to wreck everything. The idea is that you test things and you try different lenses to test things. And that's what science does. And I like science. And after I tip that bucket up, when I look in, science is still there. Yeah. But the false narratives that sneaky people have attached to science, particularly about our Paleolithic past as human beings. Yeah. There are a lot of false narratives there. And strangely, they all link back to violence and a theory of violence that seems to be trying to justify contemporary monopolies on violence, and to protect those monopolies on violence is just if you're looking for a purpose in the whole thing, I can see that purpose. Not that there's a group of people sitting in a room somewhere deciding to do that. Sure. It's just you get these self-organizing systems, and that's self-organizing systems self-organize, and that's And I can go into a few of the psychologies, not the psychologies, but those foundational myths around violence that have come out of, this sort of caveman kind of assumptions, and just challenge a couple of those. If you'd like.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
but I think Howard want to say something.
Yeah, well, that's what I found personally most powerful. I mean, I've been taking screenshots and sending them all over to people as if they were like medicine, which it is.
Yeah.
But for me, when you wrote about like the way violence, you said the universe started with a big bang, not a big hug. And as a vegan, I have been trained to dismiss all those narratives of violence, but replace them with bunny rabbits and unicorns.
Yeah, but as a vegan, you're somebody who eats babies. Like you eat babies, like pretty much your diet is just plant babies, is what you're eating all the time. You eat the children of different species. Embrace your ferocity, brother. You're a sociopath. Eat those babies.
Well, I love when you say like the problem with like violence is inherent, and like we can see that. There aren't like vegans don't think that lions shouldn't hunt. We're the best of us are trying to be more natural and be compassionate and minimize the evils of ownership and objectification of animals, but there's still a missing piece about violence that I got from your writing that I think is in every indigenous culture. It's in the Native Americans, it's in the indigenous European cultures, but the way you kind of explained it again made me feel like I could encompass that and go to a higher level of compassion, being vegan within this civilization. Like I feel like within this civilization, maybe vegan is the best I can do. But you gave me the idea, like maybe there's other ways of having or other ways of being human that don't involve civilization. So I'd love for you to talk about violence in terms of expanding the possibilities of what we could become.
Sorry, I was just thinking about the energetics thing and trying to get a metaphor around that. But look, let's just talk in complexity theory terms first. Basically, as with anything else, violence needs to be evenly distributed throughout a system, and it needs to be constantly moving. And that way it does minimal damage. It's when it becomes concentrated, like artificially concentrated. And I think you guys would know this just from your martial arts practice. You do gather energy to put somewhere for a moment. You gather it temporarily, and then you do something with it, and it's a gift that you're passing on elsewhere in the system. Now, what would happen to you if you kept gathering that energy to yourself and you held it and held it and held it?
It's not healthy. It's not healthy.
It
destroys you ultimately. It's like,
you get sick, and then an old lady's got to sit next to you on a bench and say, "Hey, boy, fucking sort your gut out." Well, you're going to die. You can't hold that all there. You got to move that on. It's going to flow through, So, violence, like anything else, needs to be distributed evenly throughout a system. And, currently we're living in a system where that's based on monopolies of violence, where certain, privileged groups get to hold a monopoly on violence.
Yeah. So that's interesting from an American point of view, living here. There's a lot of people who are kind of, libertarian in leaning, especially as you go further out to the Midwest and stuff. And their argument is we all have to have guns, so we have the capacity of violence so that the government doesn't get the monopoly on it. I mean, that's ignoring the fact that the government now has drones and stuff like that.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
it's not exactly going to wrest the monopoly back again by having one AR-15, but but that's part of their argument, I guess, to that one. But where do you see that fitting into the big picture?
They haven't thought it through. Okay, because basically, so when everything's distributed throughout a system, So in an economy or a culture, we call that a commons, like a commonwealth that we all hold together.
Yeah.
So if the capacity for violence is that, then that's something we all hold together. It's always transparent. So you don't have domestic violence that's going to hurt anybody or bloody kill a kid or anything. It's all transparent. It's all adjudicated. Everybody sees.
Yeah.
You know, it's out in the open. All right. All you need to destroy a commons is one bad actor. You know, as you know, the prisoner's dilemma. You know, it's called a multipolar trap. When you have a lot of people with an interest in one thing, all you need is one bad actor to go in and misuse that or gain an unfair advantage by abusing that system. And then suddenly everybody has to start doing that, and they have to do it forever. Otherwise, he will outcompete them and wreck the whole thing anyway. You know, so if somebody, you know, brings a gun to a knife fight, it's like, shit, now we all got to have guns.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it keeps going like that. And so people think they're being liberated by these things, but they're not. They're just being enslaved by that one bad actor or that minority of bad actors who have attempted to gain a monopoly on the violence. And it's that same dude that, you know, so, you know, it's like, oh, he's bought a knife. Great. Now we all got to get knives. So everyone gets knives. And then you turn around, he's got a gun. It's like, oh, shit. All right. So we turn around. Now we all got guns. He's got, like, I don't know, Captain America's shield and bloody, I don't know what the hell. You know, it's just this.
There's no end point to it, right?
It's what you call a self-terminating algorithm.
So do you feel like is that like an analogy for civilization as a whole, that it's kind of developed into this arms race that's got a little bit beyond itself, in which we're all kind of clawing for something which we didn't actually want in the first place, but now it's very hard to roll back the clock, you know? So.
Well, basically, it's a series of multipolar traps. Civilization starts off in a series of those multipolar traps, like the one I just described. Quite accidental usually, and then building it ends up becoming a system of perverse incentives. So the idea of perverse incentive, it rewards the worst kind of behavior, and that just feeds on itself. It becomes like anything complicated. It ends up in complexity. It ends up becoming a self-organizing system, and those are very hard things to they're very hard things to destroy. You know, like a human being's a delicate thing, as you know, on the one hand, but on the other hand, incredibly resilient. You know, it is actually quite hard to kill one of the damn things. I mean,
if you haven't got a gun,
they keep healing. They keep healing. It's anyway. It's hard to get back to that original thing. So the violence, the conflict thing, it does have to be, you know, evenly distributed, you know, throughout a system in order to do minimal damage.
So there's an interesting analogy. I mean, I don't know whether I don't want to lead you on a tangent, Howie, if there's another direction you want to take it in here, but it's like, there's an interesting corollary to that in Systema, just in practice of it, right? And it's something that people don't do maybe in the beginning, but as you get a bit more advanced, you start to realize that every time you make contact with somebody, like as another human being, when people first start to learn about violence and how to defend themselves, right? You have somebody else who feels aggressive and tense. They have a certain energy they're focusing in their fist or their head or wherever they're going to do. And you typically respond to that by either bracing up, like in the face of it, and being like, I'm just as rigid as that. I can focus just as much energy. And if I'm bigger, I can flare up like a snake or a cat or something. And if I scare you enough, you'll go away or you won't do me enough damage. Or they kind of yield to that, right? That force comes in and they just move themselves around, not allowing themselves to absorb all of that. But the more you train, the more you realize that there's no end to running away. Like if you buckle to that and you allow that concentration, then it just gets more and more bold and it gets bigger and bigger and people can chase you down. And if you collide with it, that's fine, provided that you're the stronger of the two in the first place, or you have more forces to bring together. But if you weren't lucky enough to be that way, if you're like on the lower end of an occupying force coming in, right? Or if you're just the smaller of two guys in the interaction, that is not going to work for you. You can't just collide and make it work. So the solution to that problem, the kind of the sophisticated solution that Systema offers, is that you find your environment, right? And you try and distribute as much of your force throughout your body, throughout your feet, throughout your environment. And then when people hit you, it gets distributed completely, like to your feet, to your arms, even out into the room. And so when people punch you, instead of holding you ground, you're like, boop. And then conversely, when you hit people or you try and grapple them, when you touch them or put your hands on them, you're actually trying to distribute all of that force kind of through the whole body so that you can hit them. So you kind of hit them in the soul, you hit them in the idea of them having attacked you. And then it crumbles where it was. It's almost like you're punching them in the feet, in the ground that they're standing on. And then they rather than kind of just feeling, jolted by that and feeling aggressive and coming back with even more in this kind of zero-sum game where you just smash each other until one of you's dead, rather than doing that, it kind of ends the conflict because you distribute it in your turns, right? You're taking his energy, you're taking yours, and you're going, all right, I'm not going to be all Tai Chi and move out of the way and run away, but I'm going to distribute this. I'm going to show you what we have together, and boom, that's what it looks like. And then people just sit down and it confuses the crap out of them.
I've never heard that articulated so well, ever. That's amazing.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is something that I felt from a physical perspective, but I didn't have language for until you just gave it to me 10 minutes ago. So.
Okay. So that's that's exactly it though. That's that's what, I paused before and I was trying to think about what's a metaphor for the energetics of this. And I just didn't have one, not without going into like 2 days of explaining what it would look like for 200 people to sort out a horrendous dispute in one small place. And what that looks like to outsiders viewing it, which is a riot. So, in my community, that would be reported as a riot, but that's not what's going on. And then you watch more closely and you see something different. Now, there was an anthropologist called Napoleon Chagnon way back in the day, and he filmed Yanomami Indians fighting, and I don't know if you ever came across that. He called them the most violent people on earth. They weren't very good at fighting because they didn't do much of it. They just did kind of more ritualized kind of combat kind of things. And when you look at the videos, you can see no one's getting hurt or anything. And what they're fighting about is he's come along and given them, machetes and things they've never seen before, but not enough of them, like only 3 or 4. And then they're supposed to share that between 300 people and they're having trouble. Anyway, look, he sat down for a few weeks beforehand and he got them to report to him all of their genealogies, who was related to whom and how far back that went. And they all knew it. And so he wrote that down and fed it into his computer. And then he watched the fights, and then he saw that there was a pattern coming out of the fights that people were kind of, lo and behold, helping out their genetic relations. Their genealogical groups.
Helping the people they share more DNA with more.
And they were, reluctant to fight anybody that they shared DNA with. And he said, well, these people are too primitive to possibly be able to know their genealogies. So they obviously don't consciously know that. Even though they'd reported it to him. That's where he got that information from. It wasn't a DNA test. Those didn't exist back then. Yeah. They reported it to him. And then he said they couldn't possibly know that, what they just told me. And so based on that premise, he then came up with this thing that led to that idea of the selfish gene. And it also led to the basic principles of game theory. So this idea that that human beings are basically solitary, individual organisms that are basically in the world operating autonomously and selfishly to look out for their own interests. And that's the primary thing. Any kind of social behavior we do is really only to look after our individual interests anyway, because we want to replicate ourselves, etc. And so, so you got that gave rise to the current economic system that we're living in. So one that started getting kind of introduced back in the 70s. The year I was born, right back towards the start there. And then, basically grew through the Reagan and Thatcher era, this rampant individualism kind of thing. So, you can see these ideas of projecting things back onto the primitive, especially around violence, is pretty much what's built this society. So you'll read, you read any text and it'll be a scientific text and it'll have all this awesome evidence-based stuff, like that is just ironclad and like a really good progression of logic. And then all of a sudden you'll see this line of code come in from a story that isn't, from wrong story. And they'll say something like, prior to the invention of agriculture, 30% of human beings died from homicide. And you're like,
yeah, where'd you get that?
yeah. Can you tell me what that data set you used?
Yeah.
Look at that, you bastard. Like, no, your science is good. Don't mess up your science with that bullshit. Like, seriously. Anyway, so it's going. So you basically, so all your psychologies, economics, governance, law, everything, all these disciplines are grounded in a few wrong stories about Paleolithic life and the caveman bloody thing. And it's all based on okay, so fight or flight. So as practitioners, both of you know that's bullshit.
Yeah, there's a spectrum of stuff
in your body and in the energies that you're working with, and in your mind that is more distributed than just brain bound. That's bullshit. That fight or flight is not what we're based on. That's not the basis of human behavior. And so you wonder, well, how is that so? Because you still have the story. You've got this line of code in you that's telling you, well, so a caveman walking around alone in the wilderness would be constantly in a state of hypervigilance because you never know when a tiger's going to jump out at you. But if you spend time with any Indigenous people, you'll learn really fast that we always know where the predators are. Like always. Like we know where the predators are. What's flowering, like what plants are flowering will tell us, and where the shadows are falling in combination with that will tell us where the predators are at any moment in any place. There are 1,000 things you're doing reading your context in that distributed mind. Plus we have a relationship with those predators. And so in any community that lives side by side with predators, you'll find that nobody has ever been eaten by one in that community. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And so what does that do to your
visitors get eaten sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Visitors do get eaten. And then we've got this man-eater thing, and there's there's megafauna coughing up pith helmets left, right, and center. It happens. And we're just like, oh, sorry about that. We didn't know that tiger was there. I'm sorry. Anyway, look, as human beings, we've all had relationships with these things. You've got the place where your discipline is coming from. It's like, you're talking about the people who are developing that are almost within living memory of following bears to find the edible fungi. They have a relation with those predators. And they have a relation with the wolves. And even Cossacks who were kind of in this transitional culture coming out of something land-based and real and into something industrial. These Cossacks, that they never got eaten by a wolf. They knew what they were doing out there. You could drop a Cossack naked in the middle of winter in a blizzard, and 3 days later he'd come out fully clothed with animal skins and and with it's 10 heads of the enemy kind of thing. It's and this is purely an understanding of landscape and a mastery of knowledge and relation with all of these entities in that landscape, including the predators.
But I can see how my Western mind would impose fight or flight on that, because we have a concept in our culture called loneliness, which doesn't map onto an Indigenous person. You mentioned when you're talking about the Paleolithic myth that the data set was people who weren't worthy of the sky burial. So they're the ones whose bones we have, and they're rogues, brigands, misfits. But, like in the research I've done, and I try to tell people how to eat healthy, how to exercise, but if I could give them one thing that would prolong their life and the quality of their life, it would be relationship. And so when you are like fight or flight, occurs when you're alone, right? If you're wandering away from your group, then you do have to be hypervigilant because you don't have ancestor mind or communal mind to protect you.
Yeah. So here you are. You're a modern domesticated human in your individualized feedlot. In your partition feedlot, and you're trying to imagine being dropped into the middle of the wilderness, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. Of course, you're going to see it that way. You know what I mean? And you don't really understand. All you have is weak connections. But then, sort of that you're thinking about at the front of your mind. But if you start to think more deeply about your strong connections and that web that it forms and the pattern that forms, you're like, aha, that's where my mind is. Like, I don't know anything outside of my relations. And I don't mean like, grandma and like, yes, that's part of your relations, but your relations with non-human entities and and not just carbon-based life forms, but all these things around you like rocks and everything. You have this relation, particularly to place and to land, and basically you cannot have a memory without a spatial map. And your neuroscience and cognitive sciences will back this up for you, that it's all navigational. Your memories are spaces that you navigate in your mind. You're constantly forming a map, and in that map are stories. And so there is a narrator who's narrating your life. That's part of your mind.
I can see how he's grinning there because his last podcast guest was Barbara Tversky, the famous wife of Amos Tversky, who did all the research in spatial thinking. And we just had her on our podcast, and she just talked about all the same thing, just completely from a purely scientific point of view, and how much trouble she had getting that concept through to people who are convinced that all language has to be verbal first and you think in words and stuff like that, So it's fascinating to see that coalesce from a different place, So.
Yeah. Well, let's skip all that then and just say, like, refer to that.
No, I'm just saying it's beautiful.
No, seriously, because
it's again pre-existing, rediscovered knowledge. It's like,
let's just go. Great, we already have this, so we don't have to set that foundational thing. We're sharing that understanding, so we can build on that. Yeah.
But I had 2 undomesticated hours in my life, and they were assisted by fungi. And the rocks are, the trees, the field, the breeze, like it all made sense in a way, and then it went away. And short.
You know what?
Yeah.
I always tell people to pay attention to one thing only in that, and it's not this the cosmos that they think they're experiencing. What I ask them to pay attention to is the tether. What is the tether that is going to allow you to find your way back? Pay attention to, next time you go in, pay attention to the tether and study that tether and see where it goes, because that's where you belong. You know what I mean? And it's kind of like almost the rest of the trip is a distraction, but where the most valuable information is to find out where you're grounded and what you're connected to. Here, in this place here, and that's the most valuable thing you can learn from having this tangible reality pass away for a while, is to find out where you're grounded in this reality. So you follow that tether. Do you know what I mean by a tether? Did you have a sense of being still? Well, it must have been there because you're not a vegetable.
There's a me that was there.
Yeah.
There's definitely a line. Like I remember a couple of conversations where I was just sort of giggling at what I knew in conversation with people who didn't know it at that moment.
Yeah.
Like, my wife asked me at one point, there's a plant in the garden that's not thriving. Could I maybe find out what was going on? And I just remember laughing, going, "Oh, sweetie, that's not how it works." Yeah. Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
Right. Like, the dissolution of my own ego spotlight. Like everything was what it was. I was just not evaluating it in terms of what can you do for me, baby?
Yep. That's it.
So,
Can I ask you a question? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that just look. I think the most important thing about conflict and about violence is that it's kind of necessary. It's kind of the manure that makes things work. You know, that's why, and you can't have that manure piled up in the middle of the field. It's got to be spread evenly throughout. You know what I mean? And you need it. You need a bit of push pull. You don't know where your edges are unless you get those edges smacked from time to time. You know, and basically, it's very difficult to be in co-evolutionary relation with the landscape unless there is that sort of current of violence running through. And all we know about violence is that it's ugly and terrible. It's because we've only seen that expression of uneven violence, you know. But when it's even, when it's a dance, it's a beautiful thing. So, and it was the plant that you mentioned just now. Like recently, so we've had this little mint, a mint plant out in the garden. It's been there 6 months, and it hasn't grown. It sat there, and then recently it started just withering even smaller and smaller back into itself. And it looked like it was going to die. So I didn't put fertilizer or anything like that. What I did was I went out and bought 5 other different kinds of mint and planted them all around it, really close to it. And within 3 days, that little dying mint plant had quadrupled in size. Going, no, you fucking don't, spearmint. I'm, you know, hey, peppermint, back off. I'm fucking, this is my So, you know what I mean? And that is what made it healthy. And they're in this kind of relation and dance together now, those mints, which is, they're not other. It's funny. They're all growing each other up. And it's not in this weird arms race either. They've ended up in this complementary relation, which is pretty awesome. Now, Indigenous martial arts, in the way that I've learned them and participated in them, you know, they are quite ritualized. You know, we have really strong protocols. And so a couple of them I mentioned in the book, and one of them is based on how kangaroos fight. You know, and male kangaroos always, they do those dominance, those rituals, those fighting rituals, but they never hurt each other. It is horrifically violent, and you think, oh my God, like one of those kangaroos are going to die. But they never die or get particularly injured. But it's very violent, and it's also very beautiful. And so there was one called corrida, a form that I learned for a while. I just wasn't very good at it. But the first part of it is a kangaroo dance, and then you come in and it's this very violent sort of wrestling. That's kind of beautiful. You're making something together in the space. You're making a pattern, and you're coming out together. The idea is that, you know, together you come out with whatever it is resolved.
Yeah.
And neither of you is particularly damaged. And and the other thing I mentioned was a form of knife fighting from Southeast Queensland.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that I learned. And that is really good. Because I don't know if you can imagine knife fighting somebody, and you've got 2 elders standing either side of you with spears, and if you break the rule, you're going to get speared. So you have to, no matter how angry you are, you've got to follow the rules. And the rules are, you're not allowed to cut anybody anywhere on the front of their body. You know, you're only allowed to cut them on the back and shoulders. That's it. Not on the face, only on the back. Can you imagine how hard it would be to cut somebody on the back when they're holding a knife too?
Right. Yeah.
Pretty much, in order to be able to reach their back, you'd have to expose your own.
Sure.
And so the moves that come out of that are so like 5D chess bloody moves that come out of it, that you're forced, and so your extreme creativity kicks in, and it's very hard to maintain wrong anger. Yeah. Or wrong story. You know, if you're coming into that protecting a lie or doubling down on a lie, and getting angry at that other person, that lie will not stand. Not in yourself. It will have to be purged. And the thing is that, so even if you manage to cut somebody, so the winner is the one who leaves the most cuts on the other person. But at the end of the fight, those old fellas standing off to the side with the spears, they will cut up, they'll stand them two combatants side by side, and they'll do cuts to make sure that each combatant is walking away with exactly the same cuts.
So this was something I was going to ask you about. So like Howie, I've been recommending this book to everybody that I know since reading it. And there was a friend of mine, Brian Marco, who also trains. He's an instructor in training in Systema as well. And he read this book and it blew his mind. Really, he's still just processing it. And he said that he thought that really resonated with him, because he just thought about the idea of violence as having always just like a dominant winner and then a submissive loser, and like somebody wins a fight, somebody loses a fight, and it's just always kind of this one-way interaction as you start to do it. But and then that kind of colors our whole interactions with people when we have a verbal argument. It's just like, well, I have to win. We're not negotiating anything here. I have to make sure you're humiliated and that I'm right, and that everybody who's watching knows that I'm right, and there's no distinction. But it's like, well, what if every time you cut somebody with a knife, you knew that you were going to get that back at the end of the fight, right? You knew at the end of the fight, every time you're cutting somebody, you're cutting yourself, right? The same depth, the same place, and that kind of stuff. If you knew that was the case, if you knew you were going to get it back, then it would make you fight in a different way. You would make you fight. You would still fight. You would still find a way to ritualize it and find a way to sort out the agreement through that. But knowing that you're cutting yourself would make you less cruel. And like you say, it's impossible then to carry that anger, because it would make you dumb and stupid in the fight as well. You get cut more anyway. And also it wouldn't really serve you because you're just hurting yourself. And he took that as a metaphor for what we do to ourselves in society. Do you know what I mean? Like we do this. If more people understood and kind of in a healthy way fought that way. And in Systema, we have parallels. This is the second thing I was going to say, is that we have a form of fighting called soft work, where, we'll roll and wrestle and ground fight on the ground, and we'll punch even and kick and do stuff like that. And in theory, anything goes. You can strangle somebody, you can choke them, you can get them into a lock where it could almost bust their elbow, and you can thump them. But in practice, what we do is that both people move a little bit slower than you ordinarily would, just so that you can keep the control. You move at like 60% of your full speed or something. And then if you feel any kind of resistance, so as you start to kind of try and pull somebody into a headlock, the second you feel any kind of like, oh, it's going to be a struggle to pull his head down here, you move and you shift to another position. And then in doing so, both people kind of move around each other continuously. And you have to play this complex 5-dimensional chess, because you can't rely on the aggression and the force. And it turns into something spectacularly useful, like, because you're learning to be more creative as you play. And it's putting these constraints on the combat that makes it creative and interesting. And then it also allows both people to feel satisfied at the end of it, rather than one person just feeling like they got owned and just feeling kind of hard about it or feeling sorry for themselves. Like both people come out of that kind of combat with joy, in their heart, and like they've built each other up. It's like a hearty hug, like a man hug or a slap on the back, but 20 times better. You had a fight and it was great. And you see this, sometimes you'll see this even in sports, good boxers or really professional MMA fighters or something. They'll slug it out and they'll really go for it. And at the end of the fight, they have deep respect for each other, and that's there. But it's not quite the same thing, right? It's not quite to the same extent. Usually because there's other things riding on it, like ego and titles and status, and not a little amount of money a lot of the time as well. So there's other things thrown in. But it seems to me there's an enormous place for this kind of ritualized combat and this ritualized violence for people who normally would abhor it, would be like, no, I don't want to do it. I hate hitting people. I don't like doing this. And it's because they're afraid of what it is. And the problem is that if you're afraid of what it is, it's not you're allowing somebody else to distribute the violence, like you said, right? You're allowing some people to have a monopoly on it while you try and absolve yourself of the need for it. But it doesn't work that way. Right? So,
Oh, it just goes so far beyond empathy, and it's like it's this connectedness, this really solid connectedness. And I think that's what grabbed me when I saw those YouTube videos 10 years ago, and it wasn't, and I looked at a lot of them, the Systema ones, and I was less impressed by the, massive guy all in red in a big stadium doing a demonstration. And now I will knock down 50 people with Jedi power from my balls, and everybody falls over. And and I'm sure that was real, but I was less impressed with that than I kept watching this one dude, and he was just this little short old fat dude, and just a big smile all the time, and he's just looking around all the time, and he's just in relation around him, and he's got all these massive, young, fit, strong fellas all standing around him. and he's just loving them, you know. And he's
so he's our instructor. He's the head of our system. That's Mikhail Vyabko. So
God, that guy.
he's the top guy.
That guy that I saw, and I kept watching him, and he's just smiling, and it's almost this. It's not just love, like that hippy dippy love. It's just it's what you described before, that putting yourself out into a distributor through the entire system around you, and he's just like, he's not hurting anybody. But anybody, it doesn't matter. Machine gun, whatever, they're coming at him with everything, and he's just barely moving. It's this tiny little thing with a smile on his face, and just cleaning the place up, you know. And but in such a positive way, and you can see, and it was the look on the eyes of the big men when they fell. It was initial shock, but then there was this weird kind of gratitude in their eyes, like, I just learned something. I've just come into something.
Yeah.
You've made me part of something bigger than me right now. He's just bringing them in. And that was what grabbed me. I went, I can't wait till I get to talk to one of these people. It's amazing that I'm talking to people now who that's your teacher.
What's fascinating to me is that I've been training this for 15 years, and it's taken me so many years to try to get past the beginnings of the ego and the ideas and the indoctrination and the other things to fully appreciate what Systema is and to fully appreciate what it does. What's fascinating to me is that 99% of people look at that video of the little fat monk looking guy throwing people around and smiling, and they're like, that's fake, or he's not even trying, or that's not a real fight, or do you know what I mean? Like he should be more tense. He should be more angry. That can't be like a real useful fight. And so most people would look at that and be like, that's worthless, or that's fake, or that's something else. But you, without the direct experience of training Systema, look at it and then see it for exactly what it is that it's taken me 15 years to learn. So what's fascinating to me is that, again, there's like an undercurrent of rediscovered knowledge here. Do you know what I mean? You have this knowledge from a completely different place that predates like the knowledge base that I got it from. You know what I mean? It's like there's something shared. There's something we've lost.
Place.
Yeah,
we have over 1 million years together.
Yeah.
Of shared history.
Right.
You know, we all of us look up at the night sky, and there are several constellations that are named the same way all around the planet.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's not because those stars form a particular shape in the sky. You know.
Yeah.
You know, like Orion.
Yeah.
Orion does not look like a man.
No, it looks like a fucking rhombus with the 3 dots in it.
Yeah, exactly. But everyone calls him a hunter or a warrior all around the world. You know what I mean? There's a reason for that. We share a common origin. We share a common story. We share a common purpose. You know, we are the custodial species of the planet. And we have, very particular, very special ways of working with our energies to make that happen. And it is that distributive energy system that you described better than I've ever heard it described before, better than I've ever described myself. You just nailed it. And that's it. It's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be working that stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that I, as soon as I saw that, I marked it in my head. One day I'm going to talk to these fellas, and I'm talking to you now. It's so beautiful. But it's the same thing. And we're all coming from the same place. And we all have these shattered fragments of the pattern. You know, within our relations with each other, we still have these shattered fragments of this pattern, you know, as these domesticated beings that we've become only in the last 100 years or so. It hasn't been that long. You know, nations were only invented a century ago. You know, the industrial era has been very brief, and it's domesticated us quite a bit. Most of the people on the planet 100 years ago were still living in relation to the land, and we're still living some aspect of that pattern. So it's not that long ago, and we all share it. We all carry it together, and we know what it is when we meet. And it's a beautiful thing. It doesn't take much to recover it.
Yeah. So the part that has been affecting people the most, the part of the book, is your talk about domestication and specifically how education, because I know so many people, like my son, we had him homeschooled because school wasn't working. And with all of our efforts, he still has this sense of, well, I wasn't smart enough for school. My business partner also, he grew up in South Louisiana, learning hunting and fishing and sailing and trapping and fixing engines and things like that, and loved it and felt he was stupid because he was bored in school. And you talk about like the 3 steps for domesticating a wild animal. And when I read them, I'm like, oh, that sounds like schooling. Right, separate the young from their parents during daylight hours, confine them into a space with limited stimulation, and use rewards and punishment to force them to do meaningless tasks.
Yep.
And how do we? I mean, I can feel it in myself. All the ways in which I seek approval within the conditioning of that system. How do we begin to undomesticate ourselves when it feels like we're, it's like a treadmill, like the faster I go, the more domesticated thinking I apply to the problem?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's just through that distributed mind that your teacher just told you about. It's having that. A lot of people are doing self work. They're trying to self-actualize. How can I undomesticate myself? You can't. You can only do that in a context. You're part of a self-organizing system that's observing itself, healing itself, working towards something, and you're just a node in that. So if you're able to spread your mind out to become part of the field, and then realize that it's not even yours, that you're in that, and you're a node moving around in that complex system. That's all you can do.
So there's like full responsibility and zero responsibility at the same time.
Exactly. And look, and gradually you'll come to see that all these forced choices, those binaries like that one you just said, that they don't exist. Anytime when somebody's giving you a binary, fight or flight, left or right, nature or nurture, usually it's both of those things and neither of those things at once. And then you start to see, that little 2-dimensional plane there? Oh, actually, there are a million things all coming through that. And that's coming in this bigger thing that has heat.
Everything starts to look like a small part of a brain. It's like every cell is connected to 1,000 other kind of cells, and you're just not seeing the other dendrites and neurons, in the system.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And we've been forced to look at things. It's either a 0 or it's a 1. And that's it. It's either, do you agree to these terms and conditions or do you not? It's these forced choices. Will you voluntarily get into this cattle truck, or will you get shot? And those in Poland famously who said, "No, we're not getting in that fucking truck." They were the ones who had the higher rate of survival than the ones who agreed to get on the truck. It's when you refuse the forced choices and you recover that small amount of agency just for a moment, then you start to see a universe of possibilities coming out. And if you do that collectively with others and profoundly in place, and you're doing that distributed energetic work that you've described so perfectly, you start becoming situated, in this complex self-organizing system again. And it goes, oh, welcome home. And then off we go.
Can I ask a question about how that might relate to what you described in the book as ancestor mind? Because you start to talk about what ancestor mind is as kind of like a state in which you're kind of attuned to everything, plugged in. And as soon as you started talking about that in the book, I'm like, this is what we call the state in Systema. This is the state where you feel like you're not making decisions, that you're just completely in the present moment. You're kind of drawing from something else. You're not having to cognitively process anything. And in Systema, as a way of cultivating that, we try to, or one of the reasons I think Systema exists is almost as a response to kind of like 19th century industrialization. I had a guy on a couple of a couple of weeks ago who was talking about the history of where it came from and the Cossacks and stuff like that. And a lot of the messages that are there in Systema now, like, modern life stresses. What's that?
Did you say Cossacks?
Yeah. Yeah.
See, I didn't know that connection. I was mentioning Cossacks before.
Yeah. See, I thought you knew, and that's why you brought it up.
No,
yeah,
I
has
didn't
connections.
know.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's the genealogy of that.
It's part of it comes through those Slavic cultures.
I've seen two different parts of the story.
Yeah.
And then intuited the middle part. Okay.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, I just thought you knew. I thought that's brilliant.
No? Yeah. All right, sweet.
But he was talking about how, like, a lot of what we talk about now about in Systema as using Systema as like an antidote to modern life and stress and just thinking too much about things and just like getting the wrong angle, like, the wrong story. Basically, you're building yourself a wrong story, like, and it's slipping in all over the place, right? This way, right?
Yeah.
It's talked about by the founders, including Mikhail Vodyabko, the guy that you mentioned. The antidote to that within Systema is not thinking more about how you're thinking the wrong thing or trying to think and contextualize and trying to think a different way. It's by radically improving your awareness. It's by doing practices that connect you more with your own body, with the environment around you, until you feel like that it's merged and there's a blurred line between the edge of your skin and everything that's around you. Right? I'm paraphrasing here.
Part of a system that's observing itself.
Yeah, exactly.
No longer trying to stand outside a system that you're in, trying to observe it yourself in it.
Yeah, exactly. And when you're in that state, everything comes together. You fight really well. You can see attacks before they start to build. You can intuit things about people, and sometimes it's fleeting when you're practicing and you lose it, and then it comes back again. But we're trying to cultivate that as a way of getting rid of that. Is that akin to what you describe in Ancestor Mind? It's like you try to cultivate Ancestor Mind as a way of not getting stuck in these like hyper-focused patterns?
But it's always coming from some kind of haptic practice, where you're doing something with your body, where something else, a tool or another person or emotion or something, becomes an extension of your mind, because that's the first step, and then you get into it. Now, I would argue really strongly that Howie has experienced this state more than twice with some mushrooms. You know what I mean? I would say that he's experienced Ancestor Mind regularly through his training with you. Would that be getting close to accurate, Howie? That you've had glimpses of a kind of a way of being in time and place.
Yeah, I think the trouble is, and like when I asked you the question about how could I self-actualize, like even reading the book, even being like, I didn't hear the assumption of atomization and singularity. So I think what happens is when I reflect back on those moments, I'm like, oh, like that's going to go in the greatest hits reel.
Yeah.
Right? Like it quickly collapses into ego.
Yeah.
Yes, there have been moments where I just acted in a way that was transcendent. Like I did the right thing. I said the right thing. I moved in the right way. And it's so quickly that it sort of rebounds into self-congratulation that I think I miss them a lot.
Yeah, I do that all the time. In the last few years, I've experienced quite a profound state of disconnection since moving to a city. Yeah, and I find it very hard to get into any kind of real state of being in my place. It's that thing that keeps coming back, that keeps pulling me back. And I guess when I talk to people who meditate and all that sort of thing, they talk about the same thing. Yeah. Is that moment of, I'm doing it. Ah, fuck, I lost it. Yeah. You see that when you're teaching a kid to ride a bike. Like, yeah.
Look, watch me, Daddy.
Look, no hands. Ah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I get that when I'm performing and musically and improvising. That the minute I start to feel proud of what I'm doing,
special.
Okay, well, let's your turn now.
Yeah. Well, see, that's what rites of passage do, and I'm sure you have several of them in your discipline. these rites of passage, these ritualized moments where you come through something very, very difficult that just gives you that slap that lets you know, hey, you're not special.
Yeah, one of them's literally getting slapped for 20 minutes. It's we do
Fantastic.
one where you breathe in, you breathe out, you hold your breath on the exhale, and then somebody kneels on your chest and punches you in the face and chest while you hold your breath on the exhale, and then while you're coming around, they hit you harder, and then they gradually go softer and softer and softer and softer, and it almost turns into a massage. And then when you go through it, you feel like you've lost about 50 pounds worth of tension and psychological angst and anxiety, and you kind of like it's like you pupate and you come out of something a little bit different, it's like, so that's one of the ones that we've got. It's like and we do another one with water as well, like kind of drowning like type stuff as well. There's a few kind of ritualized experiences like that, and there's massages used that way too, and the extraordinarily deep massage that goes right to the bone that's difficult to tolerate, that you have to breathe your way around and distribute the force from in order to feel good with, and then at the end of it you feel completely cleansed. There's a whole bunch of different things. Cool. So something I was going to ask about, so do you have any kind of thoughts or observations on just kind of what's happening right now? Because obviously the whole world it's been getting towards a tendency towards more progress, life getting faster and faster. The inputs we're getting from freaking social media and notifications and updates and email, it's just making us more and more ADD, more and more kind of jumping around between distracted points. It's like we can try and get hyper focused for a while, and then we jump and flip, and our attention is being pulled in lots and lots of different directions, and rarely is it being pulled this way, right, towards other people, like, and the environment that we're in, and trees and rocks and everything that's in it. It's usually being pulled like here, like back into behind your eyeballs, and spending all of your time just focusing in a very cognitive way. And obviously over the last 6 months, most places that's just been accentuated with people being forced to just being on Zoom like 6 hours a day through their work, and not being able to connect with each other. And some people, even for long periods, not even been able to go outside for a walk, in some places. What effects have you seen? And from your perspective and your knowledge, what are you seeing happening? And maybe even, what do you see the pandemic being a result of? Is it like is it an inevitable result of kind of selfish civilization and the way that we stay too long in a place, or is there something else happening from your point of view?
Look, I'm sick of people humans being blamed for this, as a species, and this idea that we're all selfish. We didn't place ourselves in these little individualized feedlots. We didn't build those. You didn't build your own cage. You're in it, but you didn't build it. So I don't like that idea of humans being selfish. And I told you the study where that idea came out of earlier, because we're not like that. I mean, as you know from your practice, that's not what we're like at our foundation. That's not what we're designed for. We're designed for something else. And basically, it does come down, the entire meta crisis we're facing now, and it is a meta crisis. It does come down to the monopolization of violence, the monopolies of violence that have been created throughout the world. And it's ever since war became an industry, in these civilizations, which is an inevitable result of civilization. That is, like I say, it's a self-terminating algorithm. And every now and then it crashes the system, and the system has to be rebooted. And it's been rebooted now so many times. But as you know, when you reboot your computer and return it to its factory settings, it's not like you've got a new computer. That computer's a little bit stuffed, and you haven't got long. Once you have to put it back to factory settings, you don't have 2 years left of life on that computer. You're going to have to get a new one probably within 12 months, and so that's where we're going. We've rebooted this thing so many times. When I say we, it's like not we, it's like 80 families, And
So
then the system itself, as I said, is self-organizing as well, but it's benefiting about 80 families. I think it's less now. I think a lot of them have been pruned out of it. It's something like 26 families now. So it's it's continually, the system is not doing well, and it is falling apart. And so these monopolies of violence, they go everywhere. Now part of part of that wrong system. It didn't start very long ago. It started as a way of regaining lands from Indigenous people in the Southern Hemisphere that people from the Northern Hemisphere had treaties with. And then they decided, well, they want that land as well. And so they came up with a trick to get that land off those people legally. So they invented this idea that land was capital. Land could be capital. That could be, and you could foreclose on that land as security in a debt. So they financialized land. And once that happened, it was pretty much the beginning of the end. It was the most profound act of violence. So once land became something, not something that people were part of, but just leverage for debt, then it killed it. It completely killed it, and it facilitated our complete separation from the landscape.
So it's almost like once that decision was made,
profound act of violence. Yeah, and
once it's self-organizing from that point onwards, almost. Isn't it?
Yeah, and so the violence done to the landscape, which is the mother, it became exponential at that stage. Became exponential, and once you have a sick system, that system throws up pathologies. You'll have pangolins that will be desperately trying to mutate in real time, and will be using its tiny, almost invisible entities, its friends that help it mutate, to try and respond to a changing environment. Those things are viruses. They help us to mutate in real time within a generation rather than across multiple generations. It helps us change our form, to come into a different place or a changing place, So you get pangolins they'll throw up pathologies that will then cross species and that will then, so pathogens are always a response. They're a comorbidity with a sick landscape. So if we're not doing our right job, if we're not in our right story as custodians of land, if we're not being in our right role as a custodial species and keeping the balances going and keeping the energies moving throughout the system and keeping those energies distributed, through ceremony and through the practice that you've described. If we're not doing that, the system does become sick. We're in wrong relation, extractive relation.
So some of this kind of like guilty explanation of things, when people try and point to specific things, like they'll be like, viruses happen because there's a wet market in China, or like these things happen because this blah, blah, blah. To you, that they're all downstream effects of that original violence that was done.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of inevitable from that point. There's no point pointing the finger after that kind of it.
And we try and blame ourselves and each other. We look at all the plastics in the ocean and we go, oh, there's just some of us who are still not recycling. But 90% of the plastics in the ocean, actually come from the textiles industry. Most of that comes from textiles, and the shift to different materials because we needed to use this oil for something more, to create these polymers, because we want to sell more of it or whatever. And when I say we, well, that's not us. We don't care how much oil they sell.
Right.
Anyway, so most of the plastics in the ocean come from textile manufacture. It's not us with our littering,
right?
And litter itself is a mythology that was invented, and we've responded to that with recycling, thinking we're going to save the planet. It's like, nah. See, when Howard, when you were a kid, when I was a kid, remember milk bottles? Everything was like that. There wasn't litter when we were kids. Packaging was, we had to be trained into accepting the idea of disposable packaging. You had your bags, you had your containers, and you kept using them. And if you didn't use them, then you collected them in a box and sent them back to be refilled. That was just normal. That's what we used to do. And that's what we've always done. We had to be trained. And you know how we were trained? We were trained through these pretend environmental movements, these organizations. So they had, in the States, they had Keep America Beautiful. Do you remember that? Keep America Beautiful, all those ads. Because we had the same ones here, Keep Australia Beautiful. That was a foundation doing that. but that was a foundation that was sponsored by disposable packaging companies.
So this is like the Anheuser-Busch saying drink responsibly.
Yeah, it was about training us to throw out our rubbish rather than reusing it. So
rather than saying I don't want rubbish in the first place.
Make me things.
Uh-huh.
This false environmental thing that was allegedly about stopping us from littering and continuing to ruin our environment like irresponsibly. It was actually to train us to throw our packaging away rather than reuse it. You know. So be responsible with your litter. What's litter? Oh, it's all this stuff. Oh, that's that stuff I reuse. Well, no, that's litter that you're ruining the environment with. You have to throw it in the bin, lots and lots of it, and we'll take care of it from there. You know, everything's a lie. All this stuff is a lie.
But what I'm hearing from you about this the story about litter is it's not only training us not to throw it out, it's training us to blame ourselves.
Yeah, and to think of ourselves as selfish, irresponsible creatures who need to comply and submit to these, institutions, in order to curb our excesses, because we're all just chimps in clothes, aren't we? We can't help it. We're ridiculous things, and if left to our own devices, it's just going to be endless rape and murder, and because 30% of humans before agriculture died from homicide. All this rubbish.
And I've heard people talking about beautiful self-organizing fractal systems in nature to justify Google having a monopoly or Facebook having a monopoly because of an 80-20 power law. That assumes that the Commonwealth has to eventually be a winner-take-all endeavor.
Yeah, it's that multipolar trap thing I mentioned earlier. Yeah, but I think your discipline has a lot of answers. In how you do it, but then also how you describe it. That message that you gave before, that needs to get out there. That one about that distributing your energy and your mind out around you, and that becoming because when people realize that they're not going to lose themselves in doing that actually you become more individually, paradoxically, when you become part of a collective being, I think that will help.
Awesome. Well, you've inspired me to double down on my practice and get better at explaining it to people as well. At the same time.
No, that was a revelation to me because I couldn't express what I was seeing in those videos, and that was it. Yeah,
it's a revelation to me that somebody can see it from the outside. Do you know what I mean? Without being trained to see it in a way, without physically going through, through the same things, and still being able to see it even through a video screen. Removed of concept. That's amazing to me. That's it just speaks to. The connectedness. There's something that we've all forgotten. There's something that we've been told a different story that's masked it. There's put all these things away, and there's I guess it seems like a cliche. This whole idea that if you take everything away, you understand that it's all a big oneness and there's interconnection, and all the boundaries we put there are artificial. But
like I said, you don't take everything away.
Sure.
You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like I had that metaphor with the bucket. You just tip it upside down and shake it, and the wrong story falls out. And like I said, when I look back in that bucket, science is still there.
Yeah.
Science is good, but these pseudo sciences that are kind of sneaky been put in there alongside the other science, they don't last. Yeah. And part of that is the caveman mythology. That has very much infected the sciences and the scientific story.
No, there's almost like it's been described to me in So I was trained as a biologist, and there's almost this. Have you ever heard of the concept of physics envy? And people talk about that. So people, when they do a biology degree, they're like, well, biologists are more woolly than chemists. Chemists are more precise than biologists. But chemists have physics envy because they can't make it all into just pure math and that kind of stuff. So physicists look down, and mathematicians look down on everybody, right? You know what I mean? So it's like physicists think they're the real scientists, and that chemists just play around with physics, which has got a little bit bigger. And then they look at biologists and say, oh, you guys are barely doing science. science, you're just kind of putting pattern onto things. But the biologist will tell you, no, these things are almost irreducibly complex. And you have to, they get so big that it's almost like an entire intelligent system. And the more we've learned about it, and the more we've tried to understand how an ecosystem works, the more or a brain works, or like a social system works, the more we realize that you can't, every time you reduce it, every time you try and look at it, and you allude to this in the book, actually, when you compare it to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Every time you study a system, something stops moving, and then you're actually, the thing you're looking at is not actually the system anymore. It's like you break something every time you look at it. And this happens in biology too. And I think the more that I've learned, the more I've had to throw out assumptions about things I've learned in biology, and just accept that it's part of a bigger whole that I'll never fully understand through that little reducing pattern spotting, let's make it as small as possible thing. And it can only be understood by kind of accepting and looking at the wider system, feeling. And that takes a different type of knowledge, different type of teaching, I think.
Yeah, that's why I always talk to people at the margins, because it is very interesting. So, I mean, my favorite people, and I seek them out. Now, my favorite people to talk to are disgruntled mathematicians. So, and some of them, and they say the most insane things. And, but there's like, they're in that sort of madness that they find, because they've been alienated from their institution or whatever, or someone's stolen their work, and they're disgruntled, or they've been cancelled, because they said the wrong thing, and the conclusions they arrive at then when they turn that mathematical lens back on all the disciplines, they're just very interesting, and they're not necessarily true or right, but they are interesting, and they do lead you in other directions. So I listen to everybody, but I particularly listen to people at the margins. And at the moment, for the last month, my favorite marginal group has been disgruntled mathematicians.
Have you ever come across Stephen Wolfram? Sorry, I had to get this one in because Brian Marco asked me to talk about him. Stephen Wolfram, mathematician, so he has this whole idea about how any system that's irreducibly complex, it moves towards intelligence. And so he's saying if you have like a natural system, which it's insanely difficult to model with mathematics, like fluid dynamics moving over rocks and things like that, that you could argue that system is now intelligent. And Brian's my friend, he's a physicist and a mathematician. He's reading your stuff and he's going, what he's saying about rocks is like Stephen Wolfram says this as well. This mathematician has said about it's so complex it can't not be intelligent in a way, right? Wow. Have you ever come across this stuff? Or?
No, I haven't. But maybe that's the definition of intelligence and consciousness, is quite simply that which can't be modeled.
Wow. That's yeah. Woo. Mind blown. That's got me now.
Yeah, like it's amazing the things that fall out, when you start getting crazy.
Is this a proper yarn? I'm interested to know. Is like this is how it works, right? Things just come out of that you didn't intend to come out of the interaction.
This is certainly yarn adjacent.
Yarn adjacent. Okay. Yeah.
It's I mean, a lot of the patterns of it. That are quite fractal, but somehow manage to return back to these themes. And they build on, like, have you noticed that there's this kind of foundational kind of truth that we keep revisiting in this spiraling sort of way, and building on it, and everything that we say together seems to build on that foundation.
Yeah, it's like it's making it clearer and clearer. It's like
we build on what the last person has said. It doesn't matter if we agree with it or not. It's like the aggregate of all those stories. Yeah. And now you're bringing in other stories from other people, and we've been doing that. And it's not just 3 people meeting here. It's about, 30,000 different people and stories that we're aggregating here. And so it has that same sort of fractal pattern of a yarn.
Nice.
Right. And one of the things that personally has moved me the most about the way you present it is, I don't even know if humility is the right word. From my perspective, it's a desire to not marginalize anybody or dismiss them. Like you talk about with what you get from the flat earthers. So I go running in the mornings and I see Trump signs on my neighbors' lawns, and I've started trying not to be narcissistic about it, trying to come up with other ways of thinking that I'm better than.
Yeah.
And so when we're, it's like you talk about haptic cognition, I feel like since I can't do this by myself, that other people are going to be like the other nodes in my haptic cognition. And in order for that to work, I can't constantly be evaluating them and putting them into these buckets of good or bad. And I really appreciate the spirit that you bring to that like profound respect. Like I think to me, that's the what I'm getting from this conversation. The basis of your work is that humans are not broken. We're not evil. We have been domesticated, been systems that we haven't seen. And you are fortunate enough to be raised and adopted into systems that showed you a different view. And you are sort of a bridge between them. And therefore you can help others to sort of, to flip up into multiple dimensions as well.
It's strangely like my alienation and marginality in both systems is what, and the profound violence of existing in that space, upon my person, which I've spent a good deal of my life resenting unproductively. That's the thing that allows me to be able to act in some kind of translation role and to be able to see all of these things, more holistically. So it's a gift. And I keep telling people trauma is not what happens at the point of impact. Trauma happens later when you fail to make meaning of that impact. Yeah. And it took me about 30 years to learn that.
I think I'm still learning it.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. This has been like such an honor, such a treat.
And for me, I was so looking forward to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Howie, if we bogarted the conversation there and steered it heavily towards the martial arts and a little bit less towards ecosystems and ways of thinking.
Well, look, more than anything, the three of us have brought together our elders here. So this is, I see this as Old Man Juma in dialogue with your teacher,
Mick Albert,
who I encountered electronically a decade ago, and probably around the same time as I was encountering Old Man Juma. So this is something that's been happening for a longer time frame than this interview.
Wow.
Which I think is lovely.
Yeah, this has been. I don't think I could have had higher expectations of this conversation coming in. I'm like, this is going to be different. It's going to be weird. It was more different and weirder than I ever could have expected, and it was wonderful. So thank you very, very much. I really hope we can stay in touch and we can talk more.
Yeah, definitely. I hope there's borders open enough at some stage where I'd like to do some of that practice, and I would actually like to go through the slappy thing.
Yeah.
At some stage before I die. That slappy ritual, because that sounds like just what I need.
Well, anytime you're in our hemisphere, let me know, and I'll see if I can arrange it.
For sure. So we'll have a knife fight and slap each other for a while, and we'll see what falls out. All right.
Perfect.
All right, brothers.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Appreciate it.
See you later. Thank you.
Bye. I would love to know what you think of that conversation. You can join the conversation in the comments at the show notes, which is plantyourself.com/436. To be fully informed, I recommend that you go get a copy of Sand Talk. And to help you remember where to find it, you can just go to plantyourself.com/sandtalk, one word, to help you get to Amazon, where you can make that purchase. You will, I think, not regret it. So let's cover garden news, which is I harvested the rest of the sweet potatoes, got maybe 10 gallons worth, so I don't know, 25 pounds of sweet potatoes. And it's too cold outside to cure them out, so we're going to have to rinse them off, put them somewhere inside to cure. But they should give us some calories for a couple of months now. We're really looking forward to those. And in running news, doing my 6-milers maybe 3-4 times a week, playing tennis once a week, Frisbee once a week, and doing yoga every morning for at least half an hour. And right now my back is real sore from the yoga, and I'm hoping that that's just muscles waking up and going, what the hell are we doing? I don't remember this stuff. And I've added some of the stomach crunches, the ab work that I used to do on a daily basis that kind of went by the wayside. I had an episode with yogini, yoga teacher Laura Hyman, Heimann. And she's the one who taught me a lot of the, like, begin the yoga with abdominal work so that your abs are woken up and firing throughout the whole sequence. So you can go back and search for her name, Lara, Lara, and you can find her and find out all about that as well. All right, time for thanks. Thanks to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use his beautiful song Sabali Dawn, the Dance of Peace. You can find more of Will's music at his website, willridenauer.com. And of course, thanks to all of you Plant Yourself podcast patrons. Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Brittany Porter, Dominic Maurer, Barbara Whitney, Tammy Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatterley, Mary Jane Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Melissa Cobb, Rachel Behrens, Tina Scharf, Tina Ahern, Jen Filkanovsky, David Bizek, The Mysterious Michelle X, Elsbeth Feldman, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colleen Peck, Michelle Landry, Josina, Sarah Durkis, Kelly Cameron, Janet Selby, Claire Adams, Tom Franzek, Jeanette Bennon, Gila Sert, David Donahue, Blair Cyborg, Dorona Vizov, Gio and Carolyn Argentati, Jody Friesner, Misha Rosen, Michael Warbeck, Aviva Lael, Alicia Lemus, Val Linneman, Nick Harper, Bandana Charlie, Molly Levine, The Inscrutable Harry R., Susan Laverty, The Panda Vegan, Craig Kovic, Adam Scharf, Karen Burry, Heather Morgan, Nigel Davies, Marion Blum, Teresa Koppel, Julian Watkins, Breed O'Connell, Sharon Hirschman, Linda Ayat, Holm Hedegaard, Isa Tuzinwa, Connie Hainline, Aaron Greer, Alicia Davis, Heather O'Connor, Carolyn Jensen, Sherry Olakoski of Plant Powered for Health, Karen Smith, Scott Marani, Karen and Joe Crabtree, Kirby Burton, Teresa Carell, Kevin McCauley, Elizabeth Rothschild, Ann Jesse, Cheryl Dwyer, Jenny Hazelton, Peter W. Evans, Dennis Bird, Darby Kelly, Laurie Fanny, Linnea Lundquist, Emily Iconelli, Levy Wallach, Rosamund McAtee, Dan Picorni, Stephen Leenan, Patty DiMartino, Mike and Donna Kartz, Deanne Bishop, Bilberry Elf, Marjorie Lewis, Tricia Adams, Nancy Sheldon, Lindsay Bayshore, Gunmarie Hagan, Tracy Gullidge, Laura Heaton, Meg from Mama Says, Stacey Stokes, Ben Savage, Michael Kay, David Hughes, Connie Rogers, Claire England, Sally Robertson, Paranganchi, Amy Daly, Brian Tourville, Mark Jeffrey Johnson, Josie Dempsey, Karen Schmidt, Pamela Hayden, Emily Perryman, Allison Corbett, Richard Stone, Lauren Vaught of Edible Musings, Aaron Hasty, Sean Owen, Sagar Naik, Erica Piedra, Danielle Roberts, Michael Lushton, Sarah Johnson, Catherine Floyd, for your generous support of the podcast. That's it for now. As always, be well, my friends.